welcome to all of the River Detectives watching today and anyone else joining us to our next online learning session in adding to our suite of Ask the Expert webinars as part of the River Detectives program to deepen learning about waterways and catchments. I'm Nicole Howie and I'm the statewide River Detectives coordinator and specifically really enjoy my job supporting the schools doing the River Detectives program in the North Central region. I really love to introduce Brady Hamilton today. Brady is joining us as our guest, and Brady has just completed his honours degree at the School of Life and Environmental Sciences at Deakin University. The focus of his project was starting Pesticide Watch, a community-based pesticide monitoring program, and quite a few of our River Detectives schools this year have participated in the first year of Brady's research. Collecting 6 water samples from April through to September and sending them off to Brady for analysis in the lab. Brady is a former teacher with an interest in environmental education and really hopes to bring pesticide pollution into the spotlight for Australian communities. So thank you so much for joining us, Brady, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It's exciting to be here.
Yes. I would like to acknowledge that I'm delivering this webinar today on Dja Dja Wurrung country in the Bendigo area, and Brady's joining us from Melbourne on Wurundjeri country. So we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging and recognise their enduring connection with waterways and catchments throughout all of Australia. River Detectives is a really exciting environmental education program, and it inspires teachers and students to connect with waterways through citizen science. So Pesticide Watch has been a really valuable addition to the water quality testing, the water bug sampling and the habitat surveys that our schools do as part of River Detectives. So it's been great to have your involvement this year, Brady, and your wonderful program. And we thank River Detective students who have submitted questions to fire at you today. They've been really interested in this topic, and we have got quite a lot of great insightful questions from students at Cornish College in the Melbourne water area, from Year 5 students there, and from Year 8 students at Wodonga Middle Years College. So thanks to those students. I'm sure they'll be watching with interest. So let's start with you, Brady. Hugo and Millie from Cornish College would both like to know how long you've been working with and researching pesticides.
So yeah, I'm actually relatively new to pesticide research. I was a teacher right through those COVID lockdown years, and it was only really a shift towards research after that I got into this honours project and yeah, was sort of invited to work on this project with pesticides. So I'm relatively new, but I do have a couple of years under my belt, and I feel like I've learned a lot over this couple of years.
Yeah, great. That's good to know, though. So you don't have to have done this for a long, long time to enter this sort of field. It's really inspiring for students to think if you've just come up with an idea of study, you can pursue it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And Abby from Cornish College wonders if you were inspired by anyone to do this work.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I think a lot of it was sheer luck that I fell into this. I was offered this lovely project by my supervisor Damien, and I think the passion has actually come from working in the field. The more I work in it, the more I learn about this issue. It's actually sort of generating its own inspiration. I'm starting to become really really attached and really interested to this issue, and I want to make a difference in it. Although that being said, one of the first things that I did when I was offered this honours project was to read Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. So yeah, she was a writer and a scientist that we should know a lot more about. She sort of wrote a book addressing the general public in the 1960s about pesticide contamination. And yeah, it was a really groundbreaking work. And yeah, I think we should know more about her. So she's a really inspiring figure in this space.
Yeah, great. I think one of the videos that I've distributed to schools to learn more about pesticides as an issue refers to her work around DDT and yeah, her book. So yeah, some students might like to look that up and follow it up.
Definitely do.
So I might share a little video for a start because it's a great little video you put together to introduce what the program was all about and how schools were involved in Pesticide Watch and what some of the aims of the program were. So let's have a look.
Waterways play a huge role in the lives of most people. Have you ever considered that there might be pesticides in your local waterway? Pesticides are the chemicals used to kill insects, rodents, fungi, and weeds. Blown in by the wind and washed in by the rain, these chemicals are finding their way into our waterways. And we know that once they're there, they drive biodiversity loss in invertebrates. Invertebrates are those tiny critters without a backbone, like dragonflies, diving beetles, spiders, and other bugs. And if those invertebrate populations are affected, then that's going to affect the animals that feed on those invertebrates. And this effect could be seen right through the food web. Hi, I'm Brady. I'm from Deakin University and I'm coordinating Pesticide Watch. Despite what we know about pesticides in the aquatic environment, we are actually seeing pesticide use increase over time. And because analysing pesticides is so tricky, we still have very little idea about what's actually out in our waterways. We want to do something about that. We're all custodians of our local environment. As Pesticide Watch volunteers, you'll be contributing water samples to a national study that will map pesticides across the landscape. This will help us identify hotspots and common culprits that are reaching our waterways. We're hoping this will inspire more focused research and some more informed management decisions around pesticide use. The Pesticide Watch program, we can, for the first time, understand the big picture of pesticide contamination in Australia.
Thinking now about pesticides specifically, we've got a few great questions. Izzy from Cornish College would like to know what year pesticides were first invented.
Yeah, that's actually quite a tricky question, because if we think about pesticides as just chemicals that are used to control pest species, they've actually been used for thousands of years. So some really basic sulfur-based things have been used to control pests that have been attacking crops right back to ancient civilizations. But the pesticides that we're talking about in this project are synthetic pesticides, and they're actually much newer. So they're sort of post-World War II. So the 1940s and 50s is when they sort of were first being marketed and becoming used on a broad scale in agriculture, especially. So really, in my grandparents' lifespan, they've gone from seeing pesticides virtually not used in agriculture, these synthetic pesticides, to them being used across the board as a matter of course. So it's sort of a relatively new issue that we're having to play a lot of catch up with in terms of the environmental impacts.
Yeah, learning as we go, which is sometimes back to front, isn't it? But as humans, we're learning from this experience. James and Lara from Cornish College would like to know how many different sorts there are, and I'm guessing there's a lot.
Yeah, there definitely are. There are thousands, even in Australia. So there are about 11,000 different synthetic pesticide products that are currently registered for use in Australia, and there are more that are being added every year. So, and the other thing about pesticides is they're not really just one type of chemical that have one particular way of working. They actually are a hugely diverse group of chemicals. They all have different ways of being effective. And so when these things are all leaching into the environment, there are a lot of question marks about what particular threats they're all facing. So when these mixtures come into contact with each other, they can actually generate more toxicity than if they're alone. Certain pesticides will threaten certain parts of the ecosystem more than others. So it's really quite a complex issue.
Definitely. Yeah, okay. Lots of work to be done. Cornish College student Gemma is wondering what kinds of pesticides are used these days. So, what would they be? How would we know that they're pesticides? And from a student point of view, I suppose, how do they encounter them?
Yeah, well, I might quickly share my screen if that's all right.
Sure.
Just to show you something that you've probably all seen before. Let me take you to this slide here. So this is a shelf at your local Bunnings. This will be in every Bunnings across the country. You can walk up the pesticide aisle, and this is just one section of a huge aisle full of pesticide products. Probably the most common type is Roundup, which is it has an active constituent called glyphosate. And there are a few concerns around glyphosate safety, especially for humans, especially with its widespread use. It's the most commonly used pesticide in the world. So that's one that is really commonly used. There are some other herbicides, things like atrazine and simazine, which target plants like weeds. Some insecticides, obviously targeting insects like imidacloprid and fipronil. And then we've also got fungicides, which tackle funguses that can threaten our food or other important resources. So things like myclobutanol are pretty common in Australia.
Okay, so that's good to know. Pesticides being a general term for insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides. So, yeah, not pests of all sorts, whether they're plant, animal, fungus.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
right.
cool. Are they always liquid? Dylan from Cornish College wonders, are pesticides always liquid?
Yeah, so they're not always liquid. They can definitely be in a gas state. So if you think about fumigants, the sorts of things that you might, fumigate your house with to remove, an infestation or something like that. There are also some solids. So think of things like granules that can be put out to kill, snails, for example. There are also, dusts. So you can think about ant dust, which
Yep.
is, I think, permethrin. So yeah, there are all these different states they can be in.
And in terms of in our waterways, we might not see them, might we? That's, I suppose, the crux of your research, that we don't know if they're there unless we test for them. They
Yeah,
could
that's
be
right.
invisible.
Yeah, so even though they're visible in the sense that they can leave residues behind, like if you go to your local park after the council has just sprayed, you can sometimes see residues on the leaves if they've sprayed glyphosate on some weeds. But once they get into the water, they do tend to dissolve. So then you're looking at, compounds that are so small that the eye can't possibly see them. So in what would look like clear water, you could actually have quite a lot of dissolved chemicals in there and have no idea.
Yeah, okay, right. And a few of our questions double up. So we've got Mia, Isabel and Lockie from Cornish College who all asked a similar question about what are the actual ingredients in pesticides that make them so harmful? Now, I know we're probably talking about complex chemical compounds here. And have you already answered that question in a way through this slide?
Yeah, I suppose so. But I think, I think it's really interesting. We do have to sort of say that these pesticides are targeting certain insects that are threatening crops, and they have certain strategies for doing that. They're toxic to certain parts of those target insects. But then when you have similar insects that you don't want to harm in the natural environment, they can still be affected in exactly the same way. So that's sort of why pesticides are dangerous, because they can have the same effects on those non-target species as the actual target species. And the other thing is that they can have effects that seem unrelated to what the intention of the product actually is. So we mentioned Rachel Carson before, and that pesticide she was looking at, DDT, that was actually found, even though its mechanism is to basically overstimulate an insect until the point that they die of exhaustion. It was actually affecting the calcium systems inside birds, and then thinning the shells of things like eagles and peregrines. So sometimes they can
Knock-on
seem
effects.
unrelated, but they can have threats. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Cornish College students Nathan, James, Tyler and Zara all wanted to know how dangerous they are. I mean, obviously that's the concern to us as humans and people who care about our waterways. So what are the main impacts on waterways, and how dangerous are they to both the water and the creatures, I suppose, and the plants in waterways?
Yeah, well, some pesticides, especially insecticides, are really dangerous, even in low concentrations in waterways, because they do target, insects, and
bugs.
insects are so important to the ecosystem overall, because they're a source of food and nutrition for so many different layers of the food web. So, that's a really big threat. They can also be, dangerous for human health as well. So that there are a number of different threats coming from a very diverse group of chemicals.
Yeah, and that's what I suppose is Matthew's question from Cornish College. Can they harm humans? Which, is not a nice thought for us, but we are in a world where pesticides are used a lot and have been for many years since World War II, as you mentioned. So related to that is a question from one of the Year 8 students at Wodonga Middle Years College. Do pesticides, I know this issue can occur with microplastics where animals can ingest small particles of plastic and then bigger animals eat those animals, and the plastic continues up through the food chain until we're eating as humans some of those creatures and ingesting some of those microplastics. Can it be a similar process with pesticides?
Yeah, it certainly can. It's not every pesticide that has the ability to do this, but there are quite a lot of pesticides that do bioaccumulate. That's the word we use for that phenomenon, I guess. Where, yeah, so smaller creatures will accumulate a lot of these pesticide products, and then, yeah, it concentrates further and further up the food web until the top end predators are starting to really suffer because they're eating things that are quite concentrated in these harmful chemicals.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. Okay. So let's hone in. Oh, and one last question actually from Bonnie from Cornish College. How do pesticides spread? So, for instance, if a farmer's, using pesticides on a crop, how do they end up in the waterway?
Yeah, there are probably two main mechanisms for that. I think the first one is spray drift, which is interesting because it can actually carry. So the wind can carry these pesticide sprays thousands of kilometers away from their source. So that's a huge amount of movement that can happen from the actual source of these things being sprayed. And they can just easily drift into streams in that process of drifting through the air. The other thing is that is rain. So runoff from these from where pesticides are applied can actually increase, especially after a dry period, they can increase the concentration up to 40 times for some pesticides running into streams. So yeah, wind and rain are sort of the big factors in getting these pesticides from where they're sprayed into waterways.
Yeah, and so with that, do you surmise, you might not know, but do you think that perhaps in urban areas where wash is coming off impervious surfaces, that would be more, those waterways would be more susceptible, or would it be occurring just as readily out in rural areas?
It could potentially be both, but yeah, I think the example I just gave then about something being 40 times as concentrated was actually a study that was done on a herbicide in urban areas. So it was looking at it being found on concrete surfaces, and after dry periods when rain came through, they were seeing a spike in concentration, about 40 times what they would otherwise have expected. So yeah, I think those impervious surfaces do play a role there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's hone in on your research and what you've started to discover. I know you've started to be analysing some of the results, and you've probably got a bit more work to do there, but river detectives, schools, Water Watch volunteers and community members from all over Australia have been helping you with this research and sending in water samples. Can you give us a bit of an indication of the size of the project, how many volunteers you've had, how many samples you've had to process?
Sure. So this is a map of the sites that we had in this first year of Pesticide Watch. So we managed to get 110 sites nationally. Most of those are in Victoria. So thank you to all the Victorian schools that helped with this. But yeah, we're looking at a group of, a very diverse group of volunteers that have contributed. We've got volunteer groups, so groups like Water Watch and land care groups, schools, both primary and secondary. Some catchment management authorities themselves have helped contribute. We've also had traditional owners and private industry helping. So it's been a really big effort from a lot of different groups of people. And yeah, we've asked them to collect monthly water samples collected over a 6-month period in 2023. So in total, we were looking at about 660 samples or a bit more arriving into our lab. And currently there's a couple of hundred that are still yet to be processed. But yeah, we've been able to generate a huge amount of data out of that already, and there's so much we can do with it.
Yeah. So One of the Year 8 students from Wodonga Middle Years College had asked, how many samples do you think you have tested since you started this project? Is that 660, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. So
you
we've
go.
processed a
Been
huge
busy.
number. Yeah,
Yeah.
very busy. Lots involved. We need to figure out lots of ways to make it as easy as possible to process these samples, or else it just
Yeah.
blows out and becomes unviable. So
I can imagine.
yeah.
So Ziggy and Archie from Cornish College would like you to explain, if possible, the steps in the lab that you use to identify pesticides in the water samples. Is that possible in layman's terms for us non-scientists?
Sure. I was trying to think of a way to describe this,
Yeah.
and I thought I'd use the example of a horse race, seeing as we had the Melbourne Cup happen
Great.
just yesterday, when we're at the time of recording. So if you imagine so you can see here in the photo, I've got a column in here, and this column has a coating on it, which it appeals to different chemicals with different enthusiasm, I guess. Some will want to stick more, some will want to race through. So we inject the sample in, and that's like the start of the horse race. So all the different pesticides start at the same point. And then over the course of the race, some will move faster through, some will drag behind. And eventually they'll all finish at different positions at the end. So if we can detect the time that each compound comes out of the column and then analyze its mass, then we can be really selective and specific about which compounds are actually coming through the column. And we can see down to a crazy sensitivity. So we're talking parts per trillion, which is about the equivalent of 5 minutes in a million years. So it's really, really, really selective, really sensitive.
Yeah.
And so that's how we can look for tiny amounts of pesticides in whole river systems.
Well, that's a great analogy. Well done.
Thank you. It's not easy.
Yeah, well done. And Neve from Cornish College wonders, is there more than one way of testing water to see if there's pesticides in it, or is this the machine that does the job and that's the best way?
Yeah, typically it's instruments like this. So we call them, so the separation, so the horse race happening and separating them out over time, we call that chromatography. So we pair a type of chromatography instrument with a mass analyzer at the end. So that's probably the best way to do it, but there are lots of ways to prepare your sample for these instruments. So we've arrived at some that are very straightforward so that we can process large numbers of samples, but there's a lot of different ways that are better for some compounds and not so good for others. So yeah, but this is sort of the way to do it, I guess, for now.
Yeah, great. Oh, well, I'm sure you're very good at it by now. So let's get to the nitty-gritty then. Cornish College student Oscar asks, how many rivers or waterways have you found with pesticides in them? Are you up to being able to share that kind of analysis yet, or not really?
I can give some broad observations so far, and I'm sorry to be the one to answer this, but we've found pesticides in every stream that we've looked for. So every sample that we've analyzed has had at least some pesticides detected in it. So the cleanest ones that we've found have been in Tasmania. So the cleanest 3 sites didn't have any pesticides at a level that we could actually measure, but they were still able to be detected. So we were still able to identify them.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's 110 sites then, isn't it, across, from Queensland to Tassie?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a pesticide of some kind in every one.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Seth from Cornish College, well, you've actually just answered this then in terms of, are there some waterways with less pesticides, and they were those Tasmanian waterways. Are there any hotspots as well on the other end of the scale that you've found so far?
Yeah, a couple of our hotspots currently, just very broadly, are actually in the Northern Central CMA. The Northern Central catchment. So we're looking at Bendigo Creek, particularly, has had some really big spikes over the 6 months of the program. And another site was one of the Mosquito Creek sites that has quite a lot of different types of pesticides found in it. So those are some of the hotspots, but we're yet to go through the whole data. We're yet to see what the samples have to tell us in its entirety. So we'll see if that changes as we're running the final samples.
And I suppose to give some context to people listening from all around the state, Bendigo Creek is a waterway that starts just south of the town and then comes right through a very obviously large provincial regional city. So gathers input from stormwater from all across the city and is probably at the mercy of things washing in from whatever. It happens to be sitting on concrete roads and footpaths and iron roofs. So that might help to explain the possible areas that is receiving water from and where those sources of pesticides might be coming from. So interesting. We'll stay tuned to that research. A Year 8 Wodonga Middle Years College student asked, have you found anything alarming or maybe unexpected since you started the project, or is it possibly sadly what you were expecting to find?
Well, I don't think we had a great idea what we expected to find at the beginning, because some of these surveys that have happened in the past have been really small in scale and small in terms of the number of different compounds they could look for. So sort of about 100 in the past. This project could look for about 800 different pesticides. So we knew that we were going into territory that hadn't really been explored before. And I think probably the most concerning thing we found is that of the 50 most concentrated pesticides that we found in streams so far, only 3 of those actually have guidelines associated with them in terms of a maximum concentration that should be seen in freshwater systems. So that means we don't actually have much guidance in terms of, what the safe levels are. Are we exceeding them? Is there harm being done? So I think there's going to need to be, a bit of intervention here to make sure that we actually know whether what we're seeing is safe or unsafe.
Yes. Yeah, great. Well, then it just goes to show how important this research is that you're doing to pass this information on. Great. And another question from Wodonga Middle Years College, just to round out this section about your research. And I suppose we've touched on it, but have you discovered whether you are more likely to detect pesticides in rural or urban areas, or has it been very widespread in terms of area?
Yeah, well, I haven't actually been able to dig into this yet. I've only really just scratched the surface of what this data could actually offer us. And the question that you have is actually the question that I want to follow up as well when this data set's complete and I'm exploring it a bit more. So I would love to look at what are the actual differences between different land use areas. So are we seeing a difference in cities, agricultural areas, wilderness areas? I'd love to be able to do that analysis, as well as look at some of the other data that river detective schools do gather. So things like, rainfall, pH, all those sorts of things, nitrates, phosphates, if they collect that as well, and see if we can figure out any patterns or relationships. Yeah, so I think that's all to come. There's so much we can do with this data, and thank you to everyone who helped us gather it.
And how wonderful that, students as citizen scientists can be, collecting really important data, and that we, scientists such as yourselves can only do so much, can't you? But having these eyes and ears and feet out on the ground helping develop the data is crucial. So really powerful for students to know they can play a role in that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no way we could do a project of this scale without volunteers like all of you. So thanks so much for that.
Is there anything else before we move on that you'd like to tell us about what you're finding, or have we covered most of it there at this stage?
I think we've probably covered most of it. I think one thing that was really interesting that came out of it was the representation of fungicides quite a lot, which have sort of been under-researched in the past and not included in a lot of surveys. So we've sort of found that maybe there needs to be more research into that. But I think the other thing that I've taken away from this is the appetite that the general public has for a project like this. It seems like people are really interested in pesticides, but they just haven't had the ability to look for them before or be able to generate any cool data from it. So yeah, I feel really privileged to have played a role in getting this project happening, and hopefully this can be an ongoing thing into the future.
Yeah. And I suppose at this point we should say too, we'll pop up at the end of the webinar details about your Facebook page. But if students have any other burning questions at any time, or anyone listening to this, they can always reach out via the Facebook page, can't they?
Absolutely. Yeah, always
Yeah.
happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. So let's have a look at the bigger picture and possibly some more positive aspects to pesticides in terms of how we can help. So Gemma from Cornish College is curious to know if people are still using pesticides today that hurt the environment and people. And Jonah quite rightly inquires, if we know how bad pesticides are, why are we still using them? So I suppose let's look at that before we move on to some alternatives.
Yeah, so I suppose that we are still using pesticides that have the potential to cause harm to people and the environment. It really is a matter of concentration, I suppose. So the amount of this that is actually leaching into the environment. At some levels, they can be really safe and really low in toxicity, and at other levels, they can actually be quite harmful. So yeah, I think it's a lot to do with exposure and the amount of time that we're exposed to these things. So a monitoring program plays a huge role in figuring out whether these things are actually dangerous and whether they're sustained over a long period of time as well.
Yeah, and obviously the regulations you spoke about before will have a part to play in terms of how people are knowing what safe guidelines are and keeping to them.
That's right. And the second part of that question was why do we still use pesticides if they're bad for us? And I suppose inconveniently, pesticides are actually really useful. So we have a growing human population that we need to feed. We need to protect, livestock. We need to protect crops. We need to do all these things. And pesticides are actually really effective at being able to control for issues that threaten our food supply. It's just a matter of making sure that we're using as low a toxicity as we possibly can, that we're using that we're trying to make sure it doesn't enter our environment, and that we're looking for alternatives actively to make sure that we can control these things in other safer ways. So that's why we're still using them, and hopefully we transition away from them where we can, but there will probably always be some situations where pesticides will actually be of benefit to us.
Yeah, no, I really love that answer we're not here today to look at the negative sides of pesticides only. It is a fact, isn't it? We do need them. We do need to be fed. So really good points there around how we do that responsibly and actively in the future looking for alternatives. So some river detectives out there might be inspiration to enter into the world of science and help be part of the solution and continue the seeking of alternatives, perhaps. So Arthur, Jazz and Esther all ask about ways to get rid of bugs without the use of pesticides, and if there are some organic, non-toxic pesticide alternatives.
Yeah, I think that there's probably a lot of promise in these biological controls. Even Rachel Carson dedicated a chapter in her book from the 1960s to these more biological controls, things like having those insect bodyguards. So I think, it's really just about, whether we can incentivize people to take up these more biological solutions rather than the chemical ones that they're currently using. So yeah, I think, and also, if these things are leaching into the environment, then it's really unsustainable. So we do need to start thinking about innovation and how we transition away from these things.
Yeah, some great work to be done there for some real pioneers into the future. So yeah, some inspiration there for some river detective students. So Miller has asked if there is a pesticide that you like to use personally. That's a bit of a loaded question, isn't it?
Yeah, not recreationally, I can tell you that.
No.
As it happens, it's actually quite hard for me to use a pesticide these
I can
days
imagine.
after being involved in this. And I don't think I've used them for a while. I actually share a driveway at my house with my neighbors, and I actually had a chat with them and said, instead of you spraying them, do you mind if I just pull out the weeds? And they were quite happy for me to do that. And it's a really
Yeah.
easy thing you can do. Just after it's rained, go outside, pull out the weeds yourself,
Yeah.
and avoid getting these chemicals in. But that being said, my attitude could change if I had a termite infestation in my house and the walls are about to cave in. So it's really about knowing when it's appropriate to use these things,
Yeah.
when you absolutely have to, and finding alternatives when you can avoid using them.
Yeah, and from my experience, I have an orchard, I have a veggie garden, I have a large garden, and again, I spend a lot of time weeding rather than spraying. But another example is even I noticed that I had things eating my strawberries, and I did a bit of research online about some ways to combat that, and found that snails and slugs don't really like sliding across gritty surfaces. So I just topped my my strawberry beds with a coarse sand instead, and that seemed to help. So and I know I've tried to trap earwigs with oil before. So just organic things, I suppose, and a lot of those work very well at times.
Yeah, great.
So yeah, there you go.
Wow, well done.
So we know that we do have pesticides in our waterways. Mac and Eliza from Cornish College wonder, looking ahead now, is there a way to remove them or not yet that we know of?
Well, it's a really complex task to remove these things, but there probably are some things we can do to try to give them more time before they leach into our waterways. So we can have things like buffer zones, where we can have natural vegetation trying to filter these things out of waterways. Even things like constructed wetlands, just to give them more time to naturally degrade before they go into larger waterways. So those are really useful things. I do think there are some people trying to innovate in this area to try to remove these things, but I think it's such a complex task.
Yeah.
We should probably more, spend our time looking at stopping them getting into the waterways in the first
In the
place.
future, that's right.
Yeah.
Yep, great. Would be lovely out of this if students wanted to share with the River Detectives program through the email or through their teachers how, what they're doing at home to do alternative pest control methods. I keep thinking of them now when we're sitting here. I've got sticky tape around the bottoms of my orchard trees, to catch the things that want to climb up the trunk. There's awesome ways, and I think there's quite a lot of resources on the Junior Land Care website too on developing organic pest control ideas for school vegetable gardens. So that's something to look into. So for you and your research, what's next in your project and in the research?
Well, I'm hoping that I can turn this into a PhD project. So that'll be something that happens over a couple of years, and will give me the opportunity to expand Pesticide Watch even further.
Right.
So I'm hoping to attract some funding to help me do that. And hopefully we can get even more than 110 sites over the next couple of years. And hopefully we'll be able to expand in other ways, do things like potentially targeted sediment sampling so that we can get some hotspots, we can get some extra data out of them. Hopefully we can do things like pair this with those other data types that you guys are collecting for us. So things like, that pH, that rainfall data, and we can maybe build some models and predict when these events are likely to happen.
Okay.
So, yeah, there's quite a lot that could happen over these next few years, and I hope that everybody stays on board and we can build the network even further.
Oh yeah, like I said, we love having it as another active hands-on activity for our students to participate in. It's so empowering with the doom and gloom around climate change. It's really hard for students to know how they can actually contribute and make a difference. So getting our programs together like this and offering some really simple scientific tests that students can do and sample collection, it's just great. It's a win-win, I think, for us and
Absolutely.
for you. Yeah. So hopefully, fingers crossed, the program will be running again next year and we'll be offering it to our River Detective schools for sure. Okay. How can River Detective schools get involved, I suppose, is what people watching might like to know. Obviously, if your school's involved, we will offer this program to your school and hopefully you will take it up. And I suppose outside of school times, can community members, so if you've got students listening or any community members listening that would like their family or their organisation to get involved, is that doable?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Especially if you're already monitoring your local waterway, it's very, very easy for volunteer groups to have a kit sent out to them. Otherwise, we're really just enthusiastic to have people involved. So we will find a way to make sure that we can get your local waterway monitored as well. The more, the merrier.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And so just to finish, in a perfect world where everything is in balance and, you know, humans and natural life are coexisting beautifully, what would you like to see in a perfect world in the future in terms of pesticides issues? What's your dream situation?
Well, I'd like to see I'd like to see pesticide monitoring programs like this right around the world. So I'd like to see, community groups being able to contribute valuable data to such an important environmental issue, and for not even just to stop at pesticides, it can be other chemical contaminants as well. So I'd like to see these sorts of monitoring programs be commonplace in local communities. I'd really like to see clear guidelines around what pesticides can be in the local waterways and ways to respond when they do exceed certain concentrations in there. I'd like a lot more transparency around, what pesticides are being used. We don't have a great understanding in Australia at the moment, given the way things are set up. And of course, I'd like to see more innovation in the area of, removing things out of waterways, better agricultural practices that stop things leaching into waterways in the first place. So things like that. I guess in a perfect world, all those things will happen, and this will be an issue we won't have to think twice about.
Let's hope so, yeah. And it can only help. Obviously, the River Detectives program not only looks at waterways, but acknowledges that waterways only exist because of a healthy catchment or an unhealthy catchment. So, part of the program is looking at other land use issues and sustainable farming practices and urban stormwater and all those things that we can do as individuals, whether we live right beside a creek or whether we live 10 or 20 or 30 kilometres from a creek. We're all part of the system that feeds into our waterways, aren't we? So
that's right. Yeah, our natural resources are everything. We can't afford to diminish them too much.
Yeah. Thank you, Brady. It's been, really inspiring, really practical suggestions and really eye-opening, I think, to have yourself come today and share your knowledge about what you're finding. It's, as you say, a topic that we don't hear a lot about. So we're just, really glad to be part of it and to build that education in our students, and because they are our future environmental leaders. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been great.
No worries. And we'll pop up a slide now if you'd like to get in touch with Brady to find out more or to ask him some further questions. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks.